Hi there, my name is Connor Ruby, and this will be my oratory on the aboltion of the for-profit prison system. Starting in 3, 2, 1. What's the price tag on a life? Can you sell a future? Where can the line be drawn? I may be directing these questions at you for the moment, but who we should really be directing these questions at is companies that support the practice of putting a price on the lives of the incarcerated. These companies include Group Incorporated, otherwise known as GEO, that run these facilities. Companies that support and fund these businesses, including BlackRock and Vanguard. And finally, CoreCivic, the largest for-profit prison company in America. Corrections Corporations of America, now known as CoreCivic, was first founded in '83, during the middle of the war on drugs. As in any time of crisis, businessmen saw an opportunity to cash in on the distress of the nation. Prisons were so overpopulated at the time that CoreCivic told the government that they could run some of the prisons, save the government some money, and even make a little profit for themselves. While this should have immediately set off some red flags to any rational thinking person that a business was now running prisons, it didn't seem to faze the government, and CoreCivic is still a huge entity to this day. To be a prisoner does not mean you are no longer a person. You still have an inalienable value that cannot be taken away from you, no matter what. You're not a tool for someone's gain and shouldn't be used as a cog in a business model. But CoreCivic and these other companies are treating people exactly that way. In 1998, CoreCivic co-founder Tom Beasley said, and I quote, "You just sell prisons like you were selling cars or real estate or hamburgers." He compares the selling of what's supposed to be a group of people trying to pay for their crimes, be better, and be reintegrated into society, to a simple hamburger. These executives are the people we're dealing with, and quite frankly, this has to stop. It's an awful business model that hurts so many, and for this reason, we need to abolish for-profit prisons, which I'll be going into. First, we need to look at the mindset. This is the exact reason that these companies have been able to stay in power. Most people think, okay, well, sure, the business model seems a bit fishy, but what's the real harm in that? This thought, however, is what keeps the business model running. This is what keeps for-profit prisons going. So this needs to be a thought that we just have to eliminate. There are a variety of ways that for-profit prisons maintain profits. One specific clause that many of the contracts between private prisons and federal state government include a minimum occupancy clause. This clause states that the government contracting with a prison must maintain a specific percentage of occupancy, meaning that if they had fewer prisoners, they would still need to pay the difference between the minimum number agreed upon and the new smaller number of incarcerated people. A version of this clause used by prisons in a paradigm rate clause, which establishes high fixed paradigm rates per person housed in a prison up to a specified percentage of prison occupancy, then a lower fixed paradigm rate of every individual past the threshold percentage. In 2011, a private prison in Arizona didn't reach their 97% capacity quota, so the state government had to pay them a $3 million fine. These fines incentivize keeping prisoners in facilities for longer, even if they would be allowed to leave in a government-owned ones. Quite frankly, states can't afford these fines, and this means that those who prove to be model prisoners and could be released from a public prison for good behavior are unjustly kept in these facilities for minimum quotas and to avoid fines? This tactic alone should show you how far these people are willing to go to make money. But there are several other problems with this model. Another problem with for-profit prison systems is how they cut costs in exchange for safety and livable quality of life. Alex Friedman was transferred to a Tennessee government prison in 1998 after having spent the past 6 years in a private facility. He told the public that they had more blankets, the toilet paper wasn't as cheap, and correctional officers were everywhere. And I quote, "First thing I noticed was there was a lot more staff, or boots on the ground, in public prisons. There was not such an emphasis on cutting costs." After being released in 1999, Friedman, now the Associate Director of the Human Rights Defense Center, began fighting for the abolition of for-profit prisons. And he has spent the past 2 decades doing so. The arguments against them, according to Friedman, are quite simple. The business model encourages cutting corners, which affects the inmates' quality and safety of life. Activists found lots of problems, one particularly being the quality of the staff. Not only were there fewer correctional officers, but they were also trained less than those at public prisons. Low pay rates led to frequent turnover, and a lack of experienced officers directly impact the inmates' quality of life. Friedman said, and I quote, "I recall one incident where a prisoner set fire within his cell. Smoke was billowing out of it. He was locked inside. The guard, instead of letting the guy out or calling for help, just held the door shut so he couldn't get out. And he might have been, And that might have been because she was the only staff member of the unit, and she was afraid that if he'd let the guy out, he might overpower her or something. But she basically just left him to burn. While this did not directly result in the loss of life of the prisoner, he was still horribly burned, and all because these for-profit prison companies were too cheap. CoreCivic's annual report revealed that their profit margin was $1.7 billion in 2015. I'd like to repeat that. $1.7 billion, and they didn't have enough money to prevent a man from getting horribly burned. A study by the School of Business at the University of Wisconsin in 2016 found that private prisons give out as many as double the amount of infractions as compared to a normal prison. This is another problem that we're going to go into. These infractions can really be given out for any reason. While an infraction could reasonably be given out for fighting, they're often given to people that prison guards just don't want to deal with, including the mentally ill, LGBTQ+ individuals, and absurd requests or reasons like prisoners that simply didn't want to eat dinner. Infractions can lengthen a prisoner's sentence, making these companies even more money, which provides a clear incentive to get them out. Infractions also lead to a higher use of solitary confinement. According to a study done by The Guardian, at some for-profit facilities, brand new inmates were automatically placed in solitary confinement as a way of combating overcrowding rather than for disciplinary issues. In fact, the same Guardian study also found that low-risk prisoners at for-profit facilities were 9 times more likely to be put in solitary confinement than those at government facilities. And this isn't by accident. Private facilities cut costs by not having to pay or build more cells, torturing people to cut costs. Solitary confinement is a cruel form of punishment that has no place in our society. It was originally introduced by Quakers in the 1800s with the belief that prisoners would use the time to study the Bible. But even they decided that it was too cruel to use. In 1890, the Supreme Court found that prisoners subject to solitary confinement became violently insane, and others still committed suicide. Solitary confinement fell out of use in the US for almost a century, but a few decades ago, we brought it back, and for-profit prisons have used it as another tool for their gain. Innately, humans are social animals, but in solitary confinement, you're kept alone for 23 hours a day, in the room the size of a king-size bed. This has many adverse effects on prisoners' mental health, including increased depression, hallucinations, and other dangerous mental health complications. However, to men like Tom Beasley and others at these companies, it's perfectly justifiable as long as it can make them some money. Right? Right? No. This is not a way to think. This is not a moral way to think. To essentially give up your humanity, actively deciding to trade lives for riches. All this profit, yet CoreCivic and these other large for-profit prison companies don't even do the thing that they said they would do, save the government some money. In a New York Times article written in 2011, it was found that for-profit prisons cost taxpayers just as much as government-run ones. For-profit prisons also are not solving anything. For one study by the NYU School of Law found that since 2000, the effective crime rate of increasing incarcerations has been essentially zero. Secondly, the Washington Censusing Project reveals that 2.2 million people are incarcerated in the US. That's 10 times the number 50 years ago. To put it into perspective, that's more than the population of some states. And the scary thing is that nearly 20% of all prisoners are held in for-profit facilities. And while this is all awful, there is a silver lining. Lawmakers of states like California and Nevada have banned private prisons from opening within the state. Businesses are also increasingly cutting ties with the industry, following pushback from their consumers. The number of inmates in these facilities are also seeing a downward trend. In comparison to its peak in 2012 of about 136,220 people, the private prison population decreased about 12% in the past 5 years. As more facilities are closing, given private prisons rely on facilities being full to remain economically viable, there is concern among executives that the failing numbers could eventually drive these businesses to their demise. And that's all great, but unless we as a society decide to change how we house our prisoners, these for-profit facilities will never be truly wiped out. We should determine whether we want shareholders and profit margins directing decision-making for our prisoners, or if there's a better policy to implement for prisoners and incarceration. So I once again ask, what's the price of a life? The answer to this question should be priceless, and for this reason, we should strive for a push to force these corporations to answer this question and shut down their facilities that make life a business. Thank you.